Beginning in the second book of Republic, the investigation into the nature of justice is controlled by an analogy between the city and the soul, so that from here on in, we wind up investigating how justice manifests in two very different contexts. It's important to understand the structure of this analogy because although Socrates occasionally does deviate from his intention, his general plan of how to compare justice in the city to justice in the soul does shape the bulk of his reflections. Let's look carefully at the passage in which Socrates announces his method. He says we should adopt the method of investigation that we'd use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to read small letters from a distance and then notice that the same letters existed elsewhere in a larger size and on a larger surface. The method we'd use then is to read the larger ones first and then to examine the smaller ones to see whether they really are the same. Now, it's obvious here that the larger letters and the larger surface represent justice in the city, which I've depicted there in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, and the smaller letters and the smaller surface represent justice in the individual. Now, if we examine what Socrates says here, there are some consequences that follow. The first is that the investigation is more properly concerned with discovering justice in the individual. We're able to conclude this because if you look at the first line in the citation there, Socrates says that we are told to read small letters from a distance. In other words, that is our task. That is the task that we have set ourselves as people who are attempting to investigate what justice is in an individual person. So the entirety of Republic, then, has as its goal understanding justice at the individual level. However, the larger term of the analogy, namely justice in the city or justice in the political community, more generally understood, the larger term of the analogy has the power to show us things about the smaller term that we may not have been able to see otherwise. Now, this has an important consequence for the way the investigation is going to work. Although the ultimate goal of the inquiry is to discover something about justice in the individual, in order to do that, we have to let ourselves get absorbed, as it were, into the inquiry about political justice or how justice works in a political community, because it's that larger term of the analogy that has the teaching power to show us things that we would not have noticed about justice in the individual, and then, looking back to the individual, we'll be able to confirm that those features of political justice are indeed present at the individual level as well. It seems to me that this is a feature of many literary analogies. Now, I'm no literary critic, but let's just look for a moment at how a poetic analogy seems to function. So if we look at the smash hit Scottish song by Robert Burns in 1794, "My love is like a red, red rose." Now, again, I'm not an expert in literary criticism, but it seems to me that this is how such analogies work. If we are to understand the nature of Robert Burns's love, we are to direct our attention to what a red, red rose is like. We are meant to contemplate the nature of that second term of the analogy, the thing to which the first term is being compared. And by doing so, by focusing our attention on the nature of a red, red rose, we're supposed to learn something about what Robert Burns's love is like. Notice that the inverse does not seem to hold. We do not learn something about what red, red roses are like by thinking about Robert Burns's love. At the very least, the emphasis seems to be placed upon learning about his love by focusing our attention on the red, red rose. And as we work our way through Republic, you'll notice that we do wind up losing ourselves in the intricacies of what a city is like, how a city comes to be, how a city passes away, becomes corrupt, etc. So at certain points of the reading, you'll feel like you are in the midst of a treatise on political philosophy or a kind of sociology of the city. Just bear in mind that to the extent that we do lose ourselves in the intricacies of the various cities that Plato will have Socrates and his interlocutors construct, the purpose of that getting lost is eventually to find our way out and draw conclusions about the individual soul and how justice works in it. Now, although the city soul or city individual analogy seems to have this feature of a literary analogy, the analogy is literal. It's not literary. Socrates really means that the same thing, justice, can really be present in both a city and an individual. He means this in exactly the same sense as we would say that the color red can be present in a fire truck and in a carpet. So he's not engaging in literary devices here. As we'll come to see later, this idea that the same thing, the same way of being, can be equally present in many particular things is a fundamental feature of Socrates' understanding of what being itself is. Okay, so here we have the basic terms of the analogy. Individual justice is the same as or is like. We'll have to perhaps make a decision as to whether we're talking about mere similarity or sameness. Justice in the individual is the same as, is like political justice or justice in the city. Now, when we talk about justice, we usually don't obey the terms of this analogy. We don't obey the idea that justice in the individual is like justice in the city. At best, we presuppose it, but in our ordinary talk about justice and in much philosophical talk about justice, we tend to make other sorts of claims. For instance, we might say that a just city makes an individual just, or even a stronger version of that claim. There can be no just individual without a just city or political community. So a claim like this is implicit in many people's attitudes towards the power of social or political context. The idea would be that in a declining political community, you will find declining or decadent personality types. In a rich city, you will find people who place a premium on wealth above all else. Socrates may think that, but the point of the city soul analogy is not to advance the claim that social context or political context determines the moral character of individuals. On the other hand, one might be of the opinion that just individuals make a city just, or that just individuals make a political community just. Stronger version of that idea would be that there can be no just city, no just political community without just individuals. So somebody who makes that claim may have the attitude that it's the individual who is really the more important unit of sociological or political analysis, and the way that a community is really more or less the sum of the characters of the individuals who compose it. Again, Socrates may think that, but he does not relate individual justice and political justice along those lines. Finally, you may think the much more neutral thought that a just city is made up of just people without trying to establish whether the city makes the people just or the people makes the city just. But again, Socrates isn't even interested in establishing that claim by the way that he relates the individual soul and the city. Indeed, what he's after is much simpler than all of this. And it's quite amazing that we tend to overlook it in our discussions of how individual morality relates to communal or political morality. His idea is really that the just city ought to be compared to the individual just person. So we are going to be comparing throughout Republic a whole city to one person, rather than putting the emphasis on how cities make people be the people they are, or how people make cities be the cities they are. Instead, we are comparing one entire city to one entire person. Now, here's how that comparison might work if justice described a kind of act. Okay, so if our approach to justice was to think of it as a kind of thing to do, so it is just to help friends in need, or it is just to give to charity, then the analogy would lead to claims like it is just for the city to help allies in need, just as it is just for the individual to help friends in need. The just city would similarly give aid to poor countries in the same manner as the just individual would give to charity. However, here's the problem. Socrates is not going to think of justice as a kind of act. If we think of the things that we do, helping people, hurting people, cheating on an exam or not cheating on an exam, bravely facing down a danger or running away from it, if we think of these acts as expressions of more fundamental dispositions or attitudes, justice for Socrates is clearly going to describe a kind of disposition or attitude from which just acts flow. So almost nowhere in this book will you see Socrates giving us a list of things that it is just to do. He seems much more concerned about an underlying disposition of the person that would result in such acts being done. However, I think we can go even further, and this is a somewhat contentious claim. We'll have to sort it out as we get into the central books. But it seems to me that justice for Socrates is something even deeper than a disposition or an attitude. It's something like a moral tenor. Now, that's a term I'm borrowing from a 20th century philosopher, Max Scheler. It's just a term. Moral tenor means something like the overall moral personality of the individual, from which even dispositions and attitudes flow. So dispositions or attitudes are going to be expressions of this whole moral personality, which justice, I think, describes the moral tenor of the person who is good. As a consequence, to be just describes a way of being a single, united person. It is the moral personality that makes you be one person over time through all of your dispositions and attitudes and through all of your acts. The important thing to hang on to here is the following. As we build up the various types of people, occupations, and social roles in our city, remember that these roles, these occupations, these classes of people, all of the parts and functions of the city will be analogized to parts and functions of the individual. So we will pay attention to the parts of the city insofar as they reveal a kind of harmony in the just city, which we will then attempt to find in the moral personality of the just individual. So the harmony of parts and functions in the just city will resemble those in the just individual. As I said, Plato does not always have his Socrates adhere strictly to the terms of this analogy. Nonetheless, Socrates' guiding intention seems to be that the parts of the just city, the arrangement of these parts, will be a kind of large-scale mirror for a similar arrangement of parts in the just individual.